Hey coders, welcome to another exciting episode with Coding with NJ. In this series, we are going to implement an e-commerce website without any frameworks or libraries. Before I give you the demo of the website, let me entice you with the key features of this project. Because this single website implementation is going to teach you so many professionally valued skills. We are going to implement this website as a RESTful website. So at the end of this series, you will not only know how to consume third-party APIs into your application, but also how to build such application that offers its services through REST APIs. The second professionally in-demand skill that you are going to learn is to develop efficient and fast websites by building them as single-page applications. Since SPS don't reload whole page each time a user interacts with the page, and only those resources are requested from the server which are not already requested. This makes websites serve to its customers much faster. Another worth mentioning skill that you will learn is to design your code with keeping in mind the long-term maintenance of the code. The most important thing for code maintenance is to keep the code separate. For example, in our case, we are going to keep the front-end code separate from back-end code. This way our code is not jumbled together, and if we ever need to find any error or any bottleneck in our code, it's much easier to find it. Or replace a patch of code with new code, that's also going to be easier. Now I know you are getting impatient, but allow me to brag about one more skill before I move on to demo. Because we are going to implement website as a RESTful website, you will also learn the nitty-gritties of how to handle course-related issues and what you need to do at both front end and back end to tackle this issue. With that, let's move on to the demo. Okay, this is the landing page of our website, which is implemented in HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, and our backend is implemented in PHP. The communication between the two is going to be done through the Fetch APIs. As you can see at the top, you can see the navigation menu, and the menu items that you can see over here, these are all basically brought in dynamically from our backend. So these are all categories in one of the tables in our database, and all these categories are currently active, so their status is active. If any of these activities status is inactive, then we won't be able to see this category over here. So this way, since it's dynamic, it has been pulled from the back end. That means we don't have to hard code the categories, and the moment we add new category to our categories table in the database, that category is going to be dynamically placed over here, and we don't need to do any further programming to make that category available over here. Then comes the banner. And again, all these banners have been pulled dynamically from the backend. They are not hard-coded. So if we add one more row in our banners table in the database, that banner will be made available dynamically over here. And if we set any of these banners status to inactive, that banner won't be displayed over here. Next comes new arrival section. So this section represents one of the recently added items to our products category in the backend. And the way they are designed is that if I click on any of these, I'm being brought into this model page where I can see the name of the product, description, price, and how many are currently left in the stock. So if the stock is less than 5, I will see in the red how much stock is currently left. And if the stock is greater than 10, then we will only see the text in stock in green color over here. Then from here, I can select the number of products that I want to buy, and then I can add it to the cart. Then if I click somewhere outside this cart, this model disappears, and if I go up, you can see the item over here. So if I go there and let's say update the category, the total value will also be updated. You can see this is the price of single item and this is the total. Let me change it one more time from 3 to let's say 4, and you can see the total updated as well. Let's go back to the main menu, to the dashboard. Next to the newly arrived items, we have featured items. So this is going to pick random items from our products database table. So each time we refresh this page, we are going to see different products being featured. So this is also dynamic. So as you saw, the featured products have been changed. However, new arrivals are same. Let me refresh it one more time. Again, our featured products changed and the new arrivals are the same. Then we have this footer section where we have links, social media links to our website, and some generally asked questions and information and other stuff such as the locations, store locations, and things like that. Currently I'm doing this shopping as a guest user. As you can see, I'm not logged in. So let me add one more item. Let's take this one, add to categories. Now we can see we have 2 products displayed over here. Let me add it one more time. We will still be able to see the 2 in the circle because the products are 2. The quantity of each product would be different, but the product themselves are 2. So let me change the quantity again from 2 to 5. Again, the number of products remains the same, and if we want to delete them, we can delete if we like. Let's go to the main section. Over here we can see all the items which comes in men's category. Then we have women's section, and we have different products related to women. Likewise, we have girls category, boys, babies and boys, and accessories. So the pictures are random, please ignore those because the focus of this tutorial is not the pictures, rather the overall website building logic and skills. Now let's try to log in. Let me put one more item so that I can show you the difference. So basically now we have 2 items. Let's add one more item. So the guest user has 3 items in its cart. So I'm going to log in as user 1, and this user has already done shopping earlier and it has some items in the cart. So you will be able to see those items. Now as you can see, the cart over here displays number 1. That means there is only one product, and this product was placed in by the user named user 1. Now you can see this user icon with tick mark and the name of the user over here. So that means this is the user who is currently doing shopping, and he's a logged in user, and his cart is completely separate from the guest cart. Now if you log out, now the guest cart is disappeared, because when you do shopping as a guest, no information regarding your shopping cart is going to be stored. But if you do shopping as a logged in user, your shopping cart is going to be saved until you purchase it. So these are some of the features that we are going to build in the initial episodes of this tutorial. Later on, when we have progressed further along in this series, we will be looking into the checkout section, the search bar, and other stuff as well. So we are going to start off by implementing this navigation bar. So the approach that we are going to take is that we are going to implement this navigation bar, its front end, its back end, and its database related stuff. And once we are done with the navigation bar, we will move on to the next section, which is these banners, and then we will move on to the rest of the stuff. The approach that I'm taking is that I'm going to develop front end, back end, and the database at the same time for each of these different components of our website, so that we can understand much easier how these components related to each other, rather than implementing the whole front end first, then moving on to the back end, and then to the database. So that's the approach I'm taking, because in my opinion, that's the best approach to learn something. Now without further ado, let's start coding today. So we are going to use Visual Studio Code Editor as our editor of choice for this project, and the root folder of our project is called Shop Online, and within this root folder I have only placed one folder named Images, which consists of many subfolders. Basically each of these folders represents images for our categories in the database. For example, this women's folder contains all the images that you see in our image products on the database. So likewise, we have accessories folder, baby, banner. So banner folder contains the images for our banner, boy, girl, man. Beside these category images, we have a logo image that will display as the logo of our website. Now we are going to start off the code. So basically we are going to implement our menu bar. So these 2 kind of rows are part of our menu bar. In the first one we have this logo, then search bar, and in the right side we have login and registration related icons and our cart. In the second row we have all the categories as our navigation links. So let's start off with index.html, and let's get some idea from our demo project for the top level structure of our index.html page. Over here our index.html starts with this navigation stuff. then we have banner, then new arrivals, featured, and finally we have some business related information stuff. So what we are going to do is that we are going to define a header for our navigation related stuff, and then we are going to have another child in the body element which is going to contain all the products and their information. So we are going to use HTML element named main. So this main will contain in return this banner, new arrivals, and featured parts. And then finally for this bottom level section we are going to create a footer. So let's go and define this structure first. Let's create a folder named user, because all the logic that we are going to define, we are defining it because eventually the consumer of our business is going to interact and buy stuff from there. So everything over here is going to be user facing. We eventually will define the admin section for this website as well, and for that I will give the name admin to that folder. So that's why I have chosen the word user for this folder. Now inside this user folder we are going to have two more folders. One is going to contain all the front end logic, and the second is going to contain all the back end logic. So for the front end logic, I have given it the name front end. So this front end is a subfolder inside the user folder, but we are seeing it this way because currently we don't have anything in our user folder. We only have one subfolder in the front end folder. The moment we put anything else in the user folder, then we will be able to see the hierarchy like this one. So images folder, and inside these images folders we have these subfolders. But this seems like a different type of hierarchy because currently we don't have anything in the user folder other than front end folder. So anyways, in the front end folder, let's create index.html file. And since we will be using CSS styling and JavaScript, so let's create those files as well. For the JavaScript file, I'm going to give it name global.js. Now let's go to index.html file and generate the boilerplate code. Let's link our JavaScript and style files. So in the head section, we are going to link our CSS file. And since we have given it the name style.css, so we are keeping it the same. Now at the bottom, at the end of the body tag, let's attach our global.js file. Now let's define the children of our body. As we just discussed, the body is going to contain 3 children: header, main, and footer. So let's create those elements first. Header, main, and footer. Currently all of them are empty. Let's go and define some contents for our header section. Now to decide on the structure of the header section, let's go back to our demo project. So for the header section, if you notice, it looks like we have 2 children in the header section. The first one seems to contain again 2 children. At the left side, it contains logo and search bar, and at the right side, registration and login and cart related stuff, whereas the second child of the header contains navigation links. Since these are dynamic links, so they will be coming from our backend. Anyways, let's define the top level structure first, and we will worry about the backend part later. So in the header, it contains 2 children. The first one, I'm going it the name heading, and the second one, I'm going to give it the name navigation. So in the heading, as we notice, it seems to have 2 further children. So let's give it name left heading. And the second child, let's give it the name right heading. In the left heading, we have again 2 children. The first one is logo, and the second one contains search bar. In the logo, we are defining an anchor HTML element because we want our image to be clickable, and no matter how deep we are in our navigation hierarchy, when we click on the logo, we should be redirected back to our dashboard page, that is index.html page. So the URL for the href is going to be starting from our root folder, which is shop online, but we will refer to it with this /. So this / means root, and which is shop online in our case. So starting from this root folder, that is shop online, we have to go to the user folder and over there we have another folder named Frontend where we have index.html file. Now this is the href link for our anchor tag, and let's define the contents for this anchor tag, and the contents of this anchor tag is going to be an image. So let's define the source for our image. So our image is a logo in the images folder, this one. So again, starting from the root, go to a folder named images, and there we have a file named logo.png. Let's remove this. Now for the search bar, the second left child, since it's a search bar, so that means we are going to need a form. So I've given this form the class name search-form. We don't need to define action attribute over here because we are going to define everything through JavaScript. And inside the form, we have an input field of type search. Let's give it the name search as well, and we don't need ID. Let's define placeholder in its place and give it value search and 3 dots. The second field of this form is again an input field of type submit. Let's give it value submit as well, and it also needs to have name because this form data is going to be submitted to the server, and server will be able to distinguish between these two fields through its names. So every input field in the form must have the name attribute defined. So let's give it the name submit as well. Okay, let's go and have a look how it currently looks in the browser. So let's open this index.html with our live server. Okay, so this is how it currently looks, but we can't see the logo. I must have done some mistake in the spelling or the path somewhere. Oh, it's not ONG, it's PNG. Okay, so this is how it currently looks. Now let's go and define the second child of our heading div, which contains this registration and login related stuff and the card. So basically, again, the right child of this heading div is again going to contain two children. The first one is going to contain login and registration related stuff, and the second one is going to contain this card. So let's go to the right heading, and over here we again have to have two children defined over here. The first one is going to, let's give it name login status div, and the second div is going to be card div. In the login div, we need to have three children defined, one for the login, second for the registration, third for logout, and fourth one is going to display the user icon along with username once the user is actually a logged in user. So let's define those children. Let's define login. This is our first child. I'm putting the text login over here. Later on, we will remove this text and bring in the font awesome icons. The second child is going to be named register. Let's put text register as well. So login, register. The third child is going to be logout, and the fourth child is logged user. Let's remove the 0. So over here we will have an icon which will indicate that currently the user who is visiting the website is not a guest user or anonymous user, it's actually a registered user, and we will also be displaying the user's name over here as well. So let's put temporarily logged user text, and since we will also be displaying the user's name as well, so let's put as spawn and give it class name. Let's give it class name logged username. I think let's change it back to username, that's more user friendly. Okay, then for the second one we will put cart over here. So now let's go and get the font awesome icons. So for that I'm going to use Font Awesome's website, and we need to bring in the Font Awesome link and place it over here in the head section. So let's go to the Font Awesome website. Now you need to have a kit created with it. I have my kit already created with Font Awesome. So if you are a free tier user for the Font Awesome, then you can only create one kit. I am free tier user, so this is the kit I have with Font Awesome. I'm going to copy this kit code and I have to place this in the head section before our style file. Now, since we have this Font Awesome kit code in our index.html, we can go and choose the icons that we want to use. So let's go and click on the icons. Then over here it shows the current version of Font Awesome. For some reasons this version doesn't seem to be working for me, so I choose the relatively older version. And now I'm going to click on this free because I am only interested in free icons. Let's start with login. So this is the login icon. Let's copy the link and let's go and place it instead of this login text. Paste. Not register, user. So I'm going to choose this one. This cross says that you are not a registered. If you are not a registered user, you can register with us. So copy and paste it over here. So this is the meaning that I have associated with this cross. You can associate any meaning you like, and you can choose any other icon if you like. For the logged user, I'm choosing this user icon with the tick mark. That will indicate that you have already been logged in. Copy. And over here, instead of this logged user tag, let's paste this. Now we have to go and select an icon for the logout. Copy. And let's paste it over here. Now let's go and choose the icon for the cart. Let's choose this one. Copy. And in place of this cart text, we have placed this tag. Now let's go and have a look in the browser. Okay, so we have got all the icons, but they are way too small, so I want to increase their size. So for the Font Awesomes, the way to increase their font size is to use one of the classes that Font Awesome has made available for us, which is, if you want to double their size, you have to use a class called fa-2x. If you want to triple their size, you have to use fa-3x, and so on. So I only want to double their size. So wherever I have inserted the I tags, I'm going to use fa-2x. So copy, paste, 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 and for the cart, paste. Okay, they look better now. So now for the first child of our header div, we have everything in place. So we have a logo, then we have search bar, then we have these login and registration related stuff, and the shopping cart. Now let's go and define their styling before we move on to the second child, which was this navigation links. So in our style.css file, the first thing that I want to do is that I want to bring in the Google font that I'm going to use for the website. So the font that I have chosen for this website is Roboto. So let's go and get the link for that Roboto font. Okay, this is the font, and these are different styles of this same Roboto font. So whatever style you are interested in, you can click on this plus sign and it will be included in this list over here. Since I have used the same font for my demo project, so I have all these three styles already selected. So I'm simply going to do is, let's go down, and I'm interested in the import version of this link. So copy everything in between the style tags and paste it at the top of the style.css file. Now let's define some basic styling for the whole HTML page. And over here, the general styling that I want to apply to every HTML element is I want to remove their margins and paddings. second thing that I want to do is that I want to set its box sizing to be border box. The reason for removing the margins and padding from everything is that every HTML element has a default margin and padding set. And since we don't know that what is the default margin and padding for those HTML elements, it's better to remove the margins and paddings and assign them the margin and paddings that suits our needs, the needs of our current project. This way we will know for certain that these are the margins and paddings we have assigned and no default margin and padding has been appended to our elements. And the reason for setting box sizing to border box is that if we define a width and height for any HTML element and then we define the margin and padding, then the total width and height is going to be the width and height that we have defined for the element plus the margin and padding. So overall, the HTML element will look different than what we have visualized in our mind. By setting box sizing to border box, whatever height and width we have defined for the HTML element, the margin and paddings that we define, they are going to be subtracted from the height and width of the HTML element. So they won't be like added on height and width to our HTML element. They will take up the space from the width and height that we have defined for the HTML element. Now we want the whole HTML element to have the font Roboto. So therefore we have to define the font over here. So let's go to Roboto font and let's copy this thing, font family, and paste it over here. So Roboto font will be used as the font of choice, but if for some reason this font cannot be brought in, then sans serif will be used as the second choice. Let's define the background color for the body. It's Alice blue. Okay. Now we want this image and search bar to be the left child of its parent and these icons to be the right child of its parents. So if we define the display property to be flex for the parent, then this will happen automatically. So the parent is heading, display is flex. Okay. These are side by side. This is the first child and this is the second child. Now we want some space between the first child and the second child. So for that we are going to set the justify contents to be space between. Okay, now you can see as much space as possible. Now we want these children to be defined next to each other as well. Therefore for each left heading and right heading we are again going to set the display property to flex. This way the first child of left heading will sit next to its second child. So the search bar will come over here. And likewise, this cart is going to come next to these icons over here. So left heading, display is flex, and right heading, display is flex. Okay. Now let's define the background color. Now let's assign the height to our heading. This one, let's define the height. So the height that we want to assign is 8% of viewing height. So viewing height means whatever the screen in which you are viewing this website. So 8% of that height is going to be assigned for the heading div. Let's give it background color and let's give it a shade of black. Okay, so this is how it currently looks. Now if you notice, the image is quite bigger than the height that we have assigned for the div, its parent div. And the second immediate problem that you can see is that some of these font awesome icons are not visible anymore. So let's try to shrink the size of this image so that it fits inside the height which has been assigned to its parent. Okay, so to make an image fit inside that 8% of viewing height, we have to explicitly define the height for its parent container, which is logo in our case. So inside this heading div, we have two children, left heading and right heading. In the left heading, again we have two children, logo and search bar. So let's assign explicit height to our logo, which is it's going to inherit from its parent. So that means it's going to be 8% of viewing height. Now for the image which is inside the logo, let's give it height 100%, and let's see if it has worked. It seemed to have worked. Now let's try to bring this search bar in the center of this horizontal bar. So since this is left heading, we have already set its display property to flex, so justify contents to center and align items to center as well. What happened? Let's give this height to inherit from parent as well. Explicit height. Okay, now fine. Okay, because we had not explicitly defined the height for this left heading, so therefore again the image got disaligned. Explicitly defining the height to inherit from its parent also gives this left heading the height of 8% of viewing height. So this way the image has no choice but to fit in its container, and they are in the center as well. Now let's go and work on the right heading div. So again for the right heading div, let's set its justify content and align items and height to inherit as well, because we don't want any kind of surprises there. Okay, now the right heading div has two children, the first one of which was given the name login status. Set its display property to flex as well, because it contains 4 children and we want all of them in the same row. Since these are font awesome icons, so we are going to set the color to white. Okay, they look better. Cart is not visible because it's in black color. We have to do the same for the cart. Okay, now we need some space between them. So let's go to login status, and underneath the login status, we are saying all the children of login status should have some margin and padding defined. So let's define some padding, and I want to define the padding to its right. So let's give each of them temporarily some margin. Let's give it 1 rem. Yeah, that's better. And since there is no space between the cart and the right side of this window, and likewise there is no space over here, so we need to define some padding for this whole row as well, which is heading. So let's go to the heading class and give it some padding. So for the top and bottom, we are not defining any heading, so it remains 0, and for the left and right, let's give it 2%. Okay, that's better. We will be making these icons appear and disappear dynamically through JavaScript, but currently since there is no JavaScript, so they are all visible. But we will need a class called hidden, such that when any of these icons contains this class, that icon won't be visible. So let's define this class as well. So let's go at the top, since this hidden class can be attached to any HTML element. So after the body, let's define this class, and the only property we are defining over here is display is none. Now let's see if this works. So what we are going to do, we are going to index.html, and let's select this user icon, the username, when the user is logged in, this one, and over here attach this class hidden. And now one of the icons should be invisible, which contains this username. Okay, brilliant. So as you can see, if we attach the hidden class to any of these icons, the icon disappeared. So we will be appending and removing this class from these icons dynamically according to our needs. But currently, let's remove this class name so that we can see all the icons there. So let's remove this class. Okay, now we need to define some styling for this left child. Again, we have to make this icon turn into a circle, and we have to increase the height of the search bar as well, and likewise the button. So let's start working with the logo image. So there is this logo image. Now we have to set its border. Actually, it's not border, it's border radius. And we have to set it to 50%. Okay, that's better. Now we need some space between the search bar and the image. So let's assign some right margin. So instead of giving the margin to the image, let's go and give the margin to the container of this image, which is logo. Padding right. Let's assign 1 rem. Okay, that's better. Now let's work on the search bar. The search bar is a div, and inside this search bar we have this form with the class name search-form. So basically we have to set the display property for this form to be flex as well, so that these two input fields must always stay on the same row, and that can happen when the display property is set to flex. So the class name was search-form. Set the display property to flex as well. Okay. Now we want to make the search icon slightly higher in the height, and we can do that by defining its padding. So we are going to define the padding for this first input field and the second input field. So we are looking for input field whose type is search, as well as input field. Oh, let's do it later. Let's work on this one first. Let's give it padding. The top, let's give it 5 pixels, and top and bottom is 5 pixels. Left and right 10 pixels. And let's give it, okay, let's have a look first. Okay, so it has slightly increased in height and width. Okay. Now let's put some space between these two elements. So for that, not left, margin right, and let's give it 10 pixels. That's better. Now we have to do the same for our input field of type submit. Okay, that's better. Now we have to define the border bottom for this first child of the header element, so that when we define the second child that has the class name navigation, we can see a clear separation between the two. So since this whole div is given the class name heading, so let's go back to the heading part. There it is, heading, and let's give it border bottom solid 2 pixels and gray in color. It's not clearly visible at the moment because it gets blended in with the color of the body element. The LS blue color and the gray color gets blended in. But once we have defined the background color for the second child of the header, which is the navigation, then we'll be able to clearly see this line over here that we can see over here. So let's go and work on the second child of header, which is navigation. So everything in the navigation, that is these links, they are coming from the backend, from the server. So currently we haven't got any backend. So the only styling that we are going to apply over here is the background color. Let's give it a slightly different shade than this one. We can't see any color because the navigation is currently empty. So it's not occupying any space in our browser. But once we assign it a fixed height, then we will be able to see it. So let's give it height. The height is going to be the same as its sibling, which is 8% of viewing height. So the header in total has now 16% of viewing height, and each of its two children have half of this 16% of viewing height. Okay, now we can clearly see these two children of the header element. The only thing left to do is that we have to bring in the navigation links, the categories from this backend, and display them over here. Now since those are brought in from the backend, that means now we have to make a fetch request to our backend and request it to get the category data. So now we have to work on the JavaScript logic, which will make a request to our backend. So that means we have to define the backend which listens for this particular request, and once that backend gets this request, it will ask the database server to give us all the categories which are defined in the category table. Since we haven't defined any database table either, so let's start by creating a database and then creating a table called category, which is going to contain all of these categories. For the database, I am using MySQL, and what you see on the screen over here is MySQL Workbench. If you are more comfortable using PHP then you are more than welcome to use that one. I prefer to work with MySQL Workbench. So over here, first of all, we need to create a database. So let's click on this icon, which creates a schema. A schema simply means a database. So we are going to create a schema or database. Let's give it the class name eShop. Sorry, not the class name. The name of the database is going to be eShop, and click apply. So this statement is going to be executed behind the scenes, which says the schema is being created with the name eShop. We are happy with that, so apply and finish. Now we've got eShop database created, so let's refresh it. So there we have this eShop. Now over here in the table, since we don't have any table, so you don't see any triangle over here, so let's right click it and create a table. So the table I'm going to create, I'm going to name it categories. Now we need to create columns. The first one is always ID. It's of type integer. It's a primary key. It cannot be null. And we have to click on this auto increment so that this ID is generated automatically. We don't need to provide it. The second one is going to have the class name. Since the category table, so let's give it name. So this represents the name of the category. Varchar 45, I'm okay with it. And it cannot be null, and it has to be unique as well. So you cannot create two categories, both having the name, let's suppose baby or accessories. Okay. Then the third is going to be the status. The category name is status, and let's choose a data type to be Boolean. Boolean or tinyInt1 will mean the same. So when I select Boolean, it's going to be tinyInt automatically. Okay. So the default value for it is going to be 0, and it cannot be null. When a new category is created, the default value is set to 0, that means it's inactive. When set to 1, that means it's active. So when we request from our front end for the categories, then the server will respond back with all the categories whose status is set to be 1, and all the categories whose current status is set to 0, those will not be sent with the reply to our front end. The reason for this is that, for example, a user is doing shopping in summer, so obviously he's not interested in winter stuff. So in summer we can set the winter category to 0. This way no stuff related to winter is going to be displayed for the user. So I think we are happy with the columns in our category field: ID, name, and status. Let's apply. So it's going to create a table in the eShop schema or database with the name category. It has ID of type int, not null, and auto increment. Then we have a field named name. Varchar 45 is its length. It cannot be null, and status, which is tinyInt1, magnitude 1, so it cannot be null, and default value is 0 as well. So this basically means it's a Boolean type. Then our ID is a primary key, and this has been, an index is automatically being created for the name, because our names are going to be not null and unique. So wherever we click on the unique tag, the unique icon over here, an index is automatically going to be created. So apply. Finish. Again refresh. Now we can see this icon over here. That means this table contains actual tables. Let's look at its data. Currently it's empty, so let's define some rows in this table. The first category name is main, and set its status to 1. Then women, set status to 1. Then we have a category named boy, it's active category. Girl, also an active category. Baby, an active category. Accessories is also an active category. We are going to define a temp category and setting its status to 0, so that when the data is pulled in from the backend and displayed in the front end on our web page, we can verify if this is working. So if we are able to see this temp category in our navigation, that means this logic is not working, and if we don't see this, that means our logic is working. let's create this table, data, finish. Now we are going to define the front end, which is going to request our backend to send all of those names in the category table whose status is set to 1. So let's go and work on the front end. Since it's going to be defined through JavaScript, so global.js, the first thing that we have to decide is when shall this request be made. So we want all of these categories to be available when the user first types in the index.html in its address bar and hits enter. That time those categories should already be populated. So that means we want this request to the server should be made when the DOM contents has loaded. So at that time, a request should go from our front end to the back end asking for those category names. And the moment those category names are made available to our front end, they should be displayed in the browser. So that means we have to define an event listener for DOM contents loaded. And DOM content loaded is an event listener which can be attached to a document. So add event listener. The event listener is DOM content loaded. And when this event is triggered, we want the following function, which we are defining next, should be executed. So the name that we are going to give to this event listener is request categories. Now let's define this event listener. It's a function, so request categories. Okay. Now, since we want to make a request, a HTTP request to our server, so we are going to utilize an API which is by default available in all the browsers called Fetch API. Now, this Fetch API takes two parameters. The first one is the URL endpoint where our server is listening and waiting for this request, and the second one is going to be an object which is an optional parameter, and this object contains different request related settings that we will provide if we are not using the default settings. If we are using all the default settings, so we don't need to provide this second object. So let's start with the URL endpoint where our server is listening for this request. So it's going to be HTTP localhost : I usually use 8080, but since at this port number our demo is already running, so I'm going to go for 8081. And over there the particular endpoint should be, now this is the URL, the domain name. Next to domain name we have to specify the endpoint, the specific endpoint. So I am going to give that endpoint the name menu.php. So this is the endpoint where if a request is received, this endpoint will return us all the names of the categories. The second one is an object, but since currently we don't need to define any settings other than the default one, so I'm not specifying the second parameter. Sorry, I don't need to put this curly brackets. So once this fetch request is made, then whenever the server responds back, we get a promise. Therefore, we have to use a then block. And since we haven't yet defined any backend, but when we define, we want to make this website work as a RESTful service, REST API service. That means the data that is going to be responded back from the server, it's going to be in the form of JSON objects. So that means whatever the data has been returned in the form of a promise, we have to convert this promise into normal JavaScript object. So currently what we have received in the promise is actually a JSON object. So then class takes an arrow function, and we are passing the promise that has been sent from the server to this arrow function. So let's give it a name. Let's call it response. And now the body of the arrow function, since we are only applying a function called response.json, so we don't need to provide curly brackets or the return keyword. So what this is JSON method is going to do is that it's going to convert the JSON object into JavaScript object in the form of promise. So since it's a promise that is being returned from this JSON object, therefore we need to have defined another then block. So this then block will catch the promise which is returned from this execution. So now let's call this one data, because now in the second then block arrow function we actually have data. So over here we can apply the logic that fulfills the needs of our project requirements. But currently we simply want to console log whatever has been returned from the server, so that we are certain that actually we have received some kind of data. We should also define a catch block. So this catch block is going to be executed if for some reason the server was unable to send us the reply back. In that case, this fetch is going to be executed. This catch is going to be executed. So again, this takes in an arrow function, and that arrow function will get the error object that has been returned from the server, not the positive reply, but the error. And we simply want to console log that error. If these then blocks executes, then this catch won't execute. And if this catch block executes, that means this thing could not be executed successfully. Okay, anyways, so we will come back and revisit this part and redefine the logic over here. But for the time being, this is all that we needed. Now we have to define its counterpart at the server side, which will listen on this endpoint, and when it receives this request, it will return us all the categories in the database table. So now let's go and define this backend side of our website. So in the user folder, let's define another folder. Now if you notice, this backslash disappeared and the front end is being displayed separately. That's because now we are putting something other than this front end into our user folder. So when user folder has more than one folder, then it will display it in the normal hierarchical form. Since the stuff that we are defining, it has to do with the backend, so let's give it the name backend as well. Now in this backend, let's define a file named menu.php. So before we define any logic in this menu.php, let's create another folder in the backend, and let's give it the name include. Now this include folder is defined inside the backend, and in this include folder we are going to keep the files with whom the front end will never interact directly. So all the files which are directly in the backend, so these are going to serve as the URL endpoints with which our front end will communicate. But in the include folder, we are going to place supporting files which are going to help these URL endpoint files perform their task. So one such thing that we are going to put in this include folder is a file which is going to connect with the database. Since database is going to be required by all the URL endpoints which we will define over here, so this is a common functionality which is going to be required by every server file, and it is never directly requested from the front end. So therefore we are putting this in include folder. So let's create a file. Let's call it db.php. And this is going to contain database connectivity related code. So let's turn this file into a PHP file by putting this tag over here. Now we need to define the logic which will make this PHP talk to our database. So we are using MySQLi for this connectivity. Let's define a variable connection, which is going to be an object of type MySQLi. And this constructor takes 4 parameters. The first one is going to be the URL where our database is listing. The second and third parameters are going to be the username and password to log into this database. And by database, I mean the database management system, what we are interacting through webpage. And the last parameter is going to be the actual database schema, or the database with whom we want to communicate. So our database is going to listen on localhost port 3306. This is the default port. If you want to omit this port number, you can, because it's a default port, but I'm keeping it. The second parameter is the username and password to log into DBMS system. In my case, the username and password are both root. If you have set different username and password for your database management system, then you have to provide those username and passwords over here. The last parameter is going to be the actual database with which we want to communicate. And since we have just created the database with the name eShop, so that is the database we want to communicate with. Next, we have to make certain that we have actually got a connectivity with the database in this object. If not, then we should terminate the program. So if this connection object now contains some value in one of its properties called connect error number. If this property is not null in this object, that means some error did occur and it has been stored in this property. So if that is the case, then we simply want to inform the user, and since we are only sending JSON data, so we have to apply JSON encoding by calling JSON encode method, and this JSON encode has been passed an array, associative array to be specific. So the first element in this associative array has the index named error, and this index contains some error message which is going to come from connection objects another attribute called connect error. So this connect error num returns us the error number, and this one the actual error message, and then we want to exit the program. However, if that is not the case, then this statement will never execute and we will have a connection in the connection object. Now we have to go and work on the menu.php file. Let's convert this file into actual PHP file by placing this PHP text. Now the first thing that we need to do is that we have to bring in that database file. So to do that, we are going to use require. Now we have to provide the path of this database file. Since this database file is inside include folder, which is in the same folder in which our menu.php file is, so we are going to say starting from the current folder, that means the backend folder, there is a subfolder named include, and in there we have a file named db.php. This menu.php file requires it. If this requiring action does not take place successfully, then this logic will not proceed any further. But if it does, then we can proceed further and define our further logic, which is we are waiting for a request from the front end. So if there is any request, it's going to be stored in one of the PHP's super global variables named server, which is actually an associative array with its indexes being named. So we are interested in one of its index, which is named request method. Now what is this request method? So whenever a request is sent from the front end to the back end, we always define what kind of request we are sending. When we don't define this request type, that means the request type is supposed to be get. Since we did not define anything in our fetch request, here we have not defined the request type, that means it's assumed to be get. Had we defined it, we have defined it in the second optional parameter by putting the word method to be get like this. But since it's a default one, so if you don't place it there, it's automatically assumed to be get. Now I have already placed it, so I'm going to keep it that way. However, the point is, if you don't define it, it's always assumed to be get. Therefore, we are saying if the request that we have received from the front end, if that is of type get, then I'm ready to serve that request. And how am I going to serve it? So what I'm going to do, by I over here is the server, the menu.php server file. It's going to use the connection object which it received from this statement, and using that connection object, it's going to ask our database to return us the category names in the categories table. So let's define this statement first. Select name from category where status equals 1 semicolon. Now all the rows in the category table that have status set to 1 return the name column of all of those rows. This is what this statement is saying. Now we have to execute this statement using connection object, and to execute it we are going to call the query method, and we have to pass this statement that we want to execute, which is in our statement variable. Now, if we have successfully executed this query, in that case, we will return a result that we are storing in this result variable. But we have to make certain statement executed successfully or not. If this statement didn't execute successfully, then this result variable will contain the value false. However, if this statement executed successfully, in that case, this result will contain the data set returned from the database. Therefore, we have to enclose this whole thing inside the if block to make sure, to be certain that we have actually got the result set and not the false value. So this if block will execute only if the result variable contains the data set. If the result does contain data set, then we are going to loop through it one row at a time using while loop. So while result, and call a function called fetch assoc on it. Now what this fetch assoc is going to do is that it's going to take one row at a time from this result variable and convert it into an associative array and returns that associative array. So therefore we have to store this in some variable. So I'm going to give it a name row. While this result set keeps returning a row in the form of associative array, this while loop will execute. and inside the while loop we can define the logic that what shall happen. So what we are going to do is that above this while loop we are going to create an empty array variable. Now this is an empty array, and inside this while loop we are going to keep populating this array with the rows that have been returned. Now since we know that we have only requested one column from this request, so therefore this fetch assoc is going to contain just one value in each row. So therefore what I am going to do is that instead of bringing that one value as an array and storing this as an array that contains only one field or one value at a time, I am going to put square brackets over here, and in the square brackets I am going to mention the name of the column that I want to be extracted from the row that has been returned. So since we know that we have only requested from one column and whose name is name, so I am saying the associative array which is going to be returned by this fetch assoc, take the index value whose name is name and store it in this row. Now this row actually contains just the name field, so let me change it to name, and we have to push this name in our empty array. Array underscore push is one of the PHP methods. So first parameter to this array underscore push is the array to which we want to push the data, and the second one is the data which is name in our case. Now this array consists of all the names of the categories. Now once this iteration has complete and all the data has been pushed to the array, we are ready to send this array as a response back to our front end. So we can do this outside this while block. Now remember, if this while block never executes, that means an empty result set was returned. In that case this array will be empty. But it's okay, we can send empty array if we don't have any data. So either this array is populated with names of categories or it's going to be empty. So outside this while block, within the if block, now we are all set to send the data back to our front end. So we are again sending it as a JSON object. So echo JSON encode, and we have to pass an associative array. The first one I'm going to give it the index name categories, and its value is going to come from this array that has been populated with names. And then at the very end, let's put the exit. We can put an else over here. This will handle the case if the query didn't execute successfully. So in that case, we want to send an error message back to our server. So now the index name is error and not categories, and the data is going to be something went wrong. Try again later. So either this statement will execute or this else statement will execute, and then we will exit. Now I hope everything is working properly. Let's start our backend server. And I'm going to start this server at the port number 8081. So php-s localhost :8080, not 8080, it's 8081. Now this statement will execute because I'm going to start the built-in development server which is provided with the PHP itself. Now hit enter. Something went wrong. No such host is known. Oh, S is missing. Okay. php-s localhost :8081. Okay, now our server is listening. This is going to act as a backend server, and it's listening on the port 8081. Our request is also being sent to the port 8081. Now let's see if we are able to make this request successfully. So let's go to our browser. Let's refresh it, and because this fetch request should have already gone when we refreshed it and the DOM content got loaded, so if everything worked fine, then we should have a data in the console. So I'm going to open developers tools, and turns out we haven't got any response, rather we have a error message. It says access to fetch at this URL endpoint from origin, which is this, has been blocked by the CORS policy. No access control allow origin header is present on the requested URL. Since our front end is a completely independent website and our back end is a completely independent website, because we are serving front end from port 5501 and back end from port 8081, that makes these two front end and back end as completely independent websites, and the request that front end is making to the back end is actually considered an external request, a request from someone who is outsider. And the default settings in PHP are that they only serve the request which come locally, means which come from the same domain on which the server is listening. So we have to provide some headers which will tell PHP to serve external requests as well. So we have to define this access control allow origin header in the PHP. And through this header, we will inform the PHP that you should serve any request that comes your way. So let's go and do that. In the menu.php, we are going to define this header. Access control allow origin. And we are, for the time being, putting an asterisk. It means no matter where the request comes in, you must serve it. Later on, we will see this asterisk will create their own problems. But for the time being, we are keeping it asterisk so that we can see when does things again stop working. We will discuss the reasons why this happened and how to resolve this issue as well. But for the time being, this is going to work fine. So let's go to the browser back and refresh our page, and let's see if we get the response back from the server this time. Let's refresh. Nothing. We did define this header, didn't we? So what could be the reason? Well, if you notice over here, I'm saying the URL for the backend that I have provided over here is, after the domain name, I'm saying the menu.php should directly be in the root folder, because this is the domain, and after slash starts our URL endpoint. So after slash we have directly menu.php, that means it's in the root folder, whereas that is not the case. Our menu.php file is inside a folder named backend, which is inside another folder named user. So we have to provide the proper URL. So we have to go to this fetch request in our front end, in our JavaScript file, and make this modification. So in this fetch, after this root, let's put in the folder named user. And inside this user, we have another folder named backend. And this is where menu.php is. Now let's go and refresh the browser. Okay, it has already been refreshed because we are using live server, and you can already see the categories, an object with one attribute or property named categories, and the value of this categories property is an array which contains 6 elements, which is man, woman, boy, girl, baby, and accessory. And remember, we had one more field in our category table which was named temp, and since it was set to status 0, it's not being sent back in the response. So now what we need to do next is that instead of displaying this data in the console, we need to make these elements available as categories over here. So now let's go and work on that. In the fetch second then class, where we were displaying console.log, let's comment this out. And now we need a reference to the navigation div, which is empty. This one. We need the reference to this div so that we can append new elements in it. So let me get reference to this nav document.query selector, and the class name is navigation. So now we have got a reference to this, but before we start appending anything in it, we have to make certain that the data that we have received actually contains a property named categories. Because if something goes wrong, then the data that we have received will contain another property called error rather than the categories. So we have to check if data.categories means if this data object has a property named categories, that means we have received category names from the server. So now we are ready to create and append them to this navigation div. So in that case, we are going to create unordered list that create element called ul. Now we have to iterate through this categories array. So data.categories for each. We can remove this. And this for each takes an arrow function. As long as we have elements in this categories array, one element at a time will be passed to this arrow function, and it will be referenced to this element name. If we like, we can short form it to cat, means category. So now we can create li elements for each of these categories. Let's give it a class name, because we will be assigning click event listeners to these li elements, and whatever element has been clicked, we want the product belonging to that category to be displayed in the browser. So we must know which navigation link or which li element has been clicked, so that we can make another request to the server to send us all the products that belong to that category. So therefore we need to have some kind of way to identify these list items as unique list items. So for the class name, we are going to give them the same name, which is the name of the category. So which is, now we have to attach event listener to it. When this li item has been clicked, we want the following event listener to be executed. Let's call it get category products. Okay, we have to define this function yet, but before we do that, let's finish the logic over here. Now we have created an li element. We have to append this li element to ul. So ul dot append child li. Now outside this for each loop, once this loop finishes its execution, then we have an unordered list with all the list items representing the category names, but this unordered list has not been appended to our DOM yet. So we have to append it to the DOM so that we can see it in the browser as well. Since we are appending it to the navigation div, so nav.append child and pass in the ul variable. So now let's go and have a look in the browser. Okay, since the text is also black, that's why we can't see it. Okay, no, nothing has been appended to it. That's because we have only assigned class name, but no text contents are defined. The text contents are also going to be cat. Still nothing. Get categories product is not defined. Okay, so let's define this function first. Let's put console.log and some message. Get clicked for the time being. Now let's give it a try. Okay, we can already see these. So no matter where we click, we can see the message being printed. So we are able to bring in the categories in our browser, and we have successfully attached event listeners as well. However, we need to yet properly define the logic for it. Currently it only has one console log message. But before we do that, now we have to define the styling for this so that we can see them inside this second row as a navigation links, like this one. Okay, so let's start styling them. Now first of all, we are going to set the display property for this unordered list to be flex. This way all of its elements are going to go in one row. Then we will set the color to be white so that we can see it against this black background. So let's do at least these two things, and then we will see what we need to define next. Let's go to style.css. Now since this li is inside the navigation link, so the ul, which is inside the navigation class, let's set its display property to flex and color to be white. Nothing happened. Spelling mistake. Okay, now you can see all of these, but they are stuck together. So we have to put some margins and paddings between all of these. Copy and paste. and then all the LIs which are inside this UL, we have to target those because we have to apply padding to those list items. So let's give it padding right, and let's make it 2 rem and see what happens. Okay, now we have to set the justify contents and align items to center for the flex so that they are in the center. So let's go back to the UL where we are setting display property to flex, justify contents to center and align items to center as well. But they don't seem to have been aligned. So let's explore what's the matter. Okay. So currently my UL is selected. As you can see, there is this equals $0. This means that this unordered list is currently selected. Now I have to check its styling properties. So styling properties over here. So if I hover over this align, now you can see that whatever is the total height of this UL itself, according to that height, contents are aligned. So it turns out that the UL itself is not occupying as much space as its parent, that is the navigation div. So we have to give this UL the same height as its parent, and hopefully then all the items in the UL will align center according to our visual needs as well. So let's go to UL and let's give it height and make it inherit from its parent. Now you can see the items are aligned visually as well, because now UL has the same height as its parent element, which is 8 viewing height, and now the items are aligned according to that height. Okay, now we have to remove this dot which is appended with each li items. So let's set list style to none. Now it's gone. Now we have to make this size bigger, the font size. We have to make the font size bigger. So let's go to li. Font weight, let's make it 500, and font size to large. Let's have a look. Okay, now we have to make sure that the first letter of each of these categories is bold. So text transform, and we have to set it to capitalize. Let's change the font size to, let's make it 2 rem, and let's see the effect. Okay, maybe that's way too much, so make it 1.6. That's better. Let's close this end. Okay, that's better, but we need some more space between each of these elements. So padding right, make it 4 rem. Maybe 4.5 rem or 5 rem. Good. Now let's refresh and let's click on these categories and see if the event listener is working. So yes, it's working. Let's click women, and this is working as well. So before we work on this event listener, let's further define the styling, which bring this, what shall I say, this blue background button. So that reminds me, we have to give the same color to our search button as well. So what we are going to do is that we are going to define, let's have a look, the color. So this is the color. Let's copy this and let's give it, let's define this as a background color. Okay, so this is how it looks. That's because we have only defined the paddings for each of these list items. However, we haven't given any margins. If we give any margins, then we will be able to see the breaks between these list items. So let's make the padding, let's make it 2 rem, and let's give it margin left to be 3 rem. So in total 5 frames distance between each of these list items. That's better. However, since we have only defined the padding right, so therefore we see the padding over here and not over here. So let's change this and equally divide the padding between left and right parts. So instead of saying padding right, we are saying padding. Now let's give it 1 rem top bottom and 2 rem Don't you think 2 rem is too much? 1 rem left and right, and let's make it 0.5 rem. So 0.5 rem top and bottom and 1 rem left and right. Let's go and have a look. That's better. Now let's give it border radius. Let's define border radius and see what should be the border radius. Let's give it 1 rem and see what happens. Okay. 1.5 rem. Let's make it 1.4 so that we can see this horizontal line rather than the complete. This is almost round. Or if we decrease the padding top and padding bottom, then we might be able to see that horizontal line. So let's make this padding top and bottom to be 0.4. Okay, that's better. Let's decrease 0.3. Yep, that's better. However, I think we should decrease the font size. They are protruding, so decrease the size. So font size, let's make it 1 rem as well. They are way too small. Make it 1.3 rem. I think I'm happy. So as far as, we need to give the same color to our submit button as well. So what I'm going to do is that let's go to the top and let's define a global variable. So if we want to define a global variable, we have to put it underneath colon root. Now let's define a variable. And to define a variable in CSS, we have to prepend it with 2 hyphens, then the variable name. So let's give it a name, primary color. And the value that we gave this thing. Paste it over here. Now let's go down. Over here we have to use the kind of a function call, but it's always named var, and over here we have to use the variable name primary color. So it's working. Now we have to give the same color to our submit button. Since we define the input, okay, so this is the submit button, and since we only want to give color to just submit button, if we define the color over here, it's going to have the color applied to the search input field as well, and we don't want that. So we have to define another block, input type equals submit. Now background color to be variable primary color. This way we don't have to define the RGBA values separately, and the benefit of that is that if we decide to change the primary color from this color to something else, we only have to make changes at one place, and they will be applied wherever that variable is used. So this is the value, but I think we should give it some smooth edges as well to both the search bar and the submit. So border radius, let's give it 3 pixels. That's better, but let's increase its padding top to 10 pixels and left and right to 15 pixels. Okay, that's better. We need to increase this margin between these list items as well. They look congested. Margin left changed from 3 rems to 5 rems. Okay. And let's make font weight to be 700 as well. Okay, that's better. Okay, so we are done with the first top level child of body element, and we have successfully finished our navigation part. In the next part of this series, we will be working on how to bring in the banner. In the meantime, if you really like this effort, please don't forget to comment, subscribe, like and share. Thank you so much.